sincerely hope that you are continuing to stay safe and healthy at this time. Today, we have Brendan Curvers and Eric Bankin here to talk about how economic relief provisions are affecting each of us at a very personal level through the food and beverage industry. We got a glimpse of this last week with Brendan, and today we'll dive further into the economic impact that could touch us deeper as far as will we even have hot dogs to eat on the 4th of July, and at what cost? We also have Jack back to discuss the new IFR issued last night, providing guidance on the refinance of EIDL loans with PPP loan proceeds and lender remittance of EIDL refinance proceeds to the SBA. Welcome back, guys.
Hey, Jen.
Hey.
We appreciate all your questions and interactions that have come through the inbox at livestream at claconnect.com. The questions are wonderful, and we are monitoring and responding to them as best we can daily. Please keep them coming through this session, and we'll address as many as we can while we're live with you today. We also would like to direct you to our COVID landing page at claconnect.com for up-to-date information about all of these programs, tools, and ways to contact us for more specific consultation. I'd like to start today's conversation with Eric Bankin, a principal in our agribusiness and cooperative group and CLA's leader in the livestock industries. You heard Brendan call him Prince of Pork last week, and I've always called him the King of Bacon. So welcome back, Eric.
You got to have fun, Jen, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So
maybe a future Twitter handle in there.
Something like that.
We'll have to run that by marketing, maybe.
Yeah, we all have to have our claim to fame. So welcome to the show, Eric. We're excited to have you here. So why don't you kick us off with just a quick overview of what you're going to discuss?
Yeah, thanks for having me. You know, keeping the ultimate consumer in mind with the July 4th holiday around the corner, I'd like to talk about the traditional livestock meats that we all love to grill. I'm talking about your favorite cuts of steak, brats, hot dogs, ribs, burgers, and anything wrapped in bacon. And by the way, if you're not good at grilling, try grilling a frozen steak. I highly recommend it. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I never knew that. And I was the grill master in our family for a while and never threw a frozen one on there. So next time I'll give it a try. And it's funny, when I prepare food, I usually don't think about the U.S. farmer just because I'm so focused on the meal for my family and the recipes. So I'd like to hear from you, Eric, about how the U.S. livestock producer has fared so far in 2020.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, Jen. I do the same thing when I buy groceries. I forget about the U.S. farmer. So for the livestock producers, the 2020 commodity markets have been something close to resembling what I can describe as a hibernating polar bear. I mean, the market is so frigid and cold, and it just won't rise from its slumber. It's been a tough year. So it was a down market due to normal trade disputes, tariffs, and political posturing. It really came to a crash when COVID disrupted the U.S. supply chain in April and May.
Yeah, I remember seeing the headlines on COVID outbreaks in the meatpacking plants. What impact did that have on U.S. producers?
Yeah, so the food supply chain is a well-timed machine from farm to retail. And when many of the plants temporarily closed or slowed chain speeds in April and May, a severe bottleneck occurred on the farm. The producer had no options or little options to deliver loads of market-ready animals. And further compounding the problem was as producers scrambled to find buyers, what do animals continue to do? They continue to eat and continue to grow, which is no fault of their own. It's what they are. They're biologically designed to eat. And so to stop feeding an animal in many forms is animal cruelty. So the producers continue to care for the livestock well beyond the point at which they are intended to be harvested. Not only was there a backlog from a head count perspective, but the animals were much heavier than ideal from the additional days on feed, which actually discounts the value of the animal. As the producer incurred greater cost to feed and care for the animals, kind of like a double whammy. And further, so then you add the fact that many farms have gestation and periods as they're raising babies and giving birth, and those remain consistent. And it created a real space problem for producers. Weaning and weaned animals coming into the farm system, and the market animals weren't leaving the system. So producers had to fill the barns well beyond capacity to house the animals, which overall is not healthy for the animals. So almost all producers at some point considered depopulation of their herds. And some did, in fact, have to depopulate. It was very difficult and a very emotional time for our U.S. producers.
Yeah, it's difficult to even hear about. So you feel so bad for the US producers and being in that situation because there really is no favorable option at that point for them to choose. So if we
Mhm.
fast forward to today, what has transpired since the initial COVID outbreaks?
Yeah, so President Trump used the Defense Production Act to identify meat packing and processing plants as critical to U.S. infrastructure. So, what this did is it forced meat packing plants to stay open, ultimately forced plant management to work with local government officials to create a safe work environment for the employees and ultimately the communities in which they are located. And the latest USDA report has both pork and cattle harvest at or exceeding prior year actual on head count. And many of the animals going to harvest are 5 to 10% heavier than normal. So increased harvest count plus your heavier carcasses equals more meat coming into the supply chain. Now, a backlog remains in most U.S. producer operations, as it will take many, many months to catch up to what was lost as plants continue to ramp up chain speed and running 6 days a week versus 5. Livestock markets continue to be in hibernation, and that's not expected to change in 2020, at least based on current future markets. So, although 2020's Independence Day holiday will surely be different in comparison to recent years, your favorite grilling meats should be available at your local grocer.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. That's such good insight and can really help us understand what's happening at a different level when we come to the table to cook our food, kind of what's all happening behind the scenes. So thank
Mhm.
you for that insight. We're going to pivot now to Brendan's discussion for food and beverage production. Brendan comes to us from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he leads the manufacturing and distribution industry group. He serves a variety of manufacturing and distribution companies, but he has a deep passion and concentration of clients that are specific to food and beverage manufacturers and distributors. So welcome back, Brendan. It's great to have you back.
Thanks, Jen. Good to be back again, and thanks everyone for being here for another live stream with us. Eric, all this talk of pork and beef has me dreaming of the upcoming 4th of July festivities. Eric, again, thanks for the detailed information on what we can expect from the livestock and meat production perspective. Based on the findings you provided earlier, we really wanted to set the stage in terms of pricing struggles through the supply chain. With that said, we expect the livestock and meat production sector to feel at least some level of pricing impacts, which will ultimately be passed to the retail outlets, which at the end of the day end up passing on to you and I, the end consumer. We'll get into that a little bit later, but first we wanted to jump into the next phase of our journey, which will really take us from the farm to the food production floor. As many of you have seen on the news recently, it is hard to go a day without hearing about another mass breakout of COVID cases impacting a major food producer. In fact, some food producers are scaling down or were even temporarily shut down due to the harsh reality of containment measures. However, as Eric mentioned, the supply chain has proven to be quite resilient. In fact, meat production is up about 95% in terms of capacity versus prior year June. This is mainly attributable due to the Defense Production Act that Eric mentioned earlier and the backlog stemming from late April and May. So we expect that the days of meat production shortages are likely in the rear view, at least for the time being.
Well, that's a relief, and with the new normal starting to become the reality for food and beverage manufacturers, what are some key strategies that we are seeing in the industry? And how does that translate to what consumers are starting to see in terms of like food pricing and things like that?
Sure, it's a great question, Jen. We're really seeing a variety of strategies being implemented across all varieties of the food production supply chain. Some of these strategies include creating contingency plans, which really enhance that agility to promote strategic actions. There's also a significant reinvestment in supply chain visibility, or sometimes that first large investment into supply chain visibility. And also, really, companies are starting to explore what that omni-channel solution looks like, or a diversified retail capability. At the end of the day, this really helps them answer the question of how do they get the product to the end consumer like you and I. Most of you are probably wondering why that's important. So let's get into that. In short, This likely means an increase in cost being passed on to the retailer, which, as we mentioned earlier, is passing directly on to us as a consumer. So here are some examples of fixed cost structure changes that are happening in that middle of the supply chain due to COVID business strategies that many food producers are seeing today. So let's start with really many food producers had to make a go-to market pivot. So food producers that typically sold to restaurants maybe had to test out that e-commerce platform. As a result, consumers will likely see price impacts due to this changeover, and also may have to look in alternative solution areas to find those loved products that you may be used to find in a restaurant or a grocery store. They may only be found online or at an alternative retailer in today's world. Secondarily, most food producers had to invest in enhanced employee safety and building security. Again, this is something that's very preventative and based on OSHA standards, so it's required, but these changes tend to be costly, and depending on the system that was in place pre-COVID, tend to be quite disruptive, as we've seen over the last few months. So on a positive note, this should give you some comfort in, what you're really eating is safe to eat. Finally, we'll conclude with most food manufacturers and producers had to make some level of significant investment in capital expenditures, typically around the tech stack infrastructure. So what do you mean by that? Well, lot tracking is becoming more and more important after multiple foodborne illness outbreaks in 2019. So this, again, was something that was already impacting food producers pre-COVID. Many food processors made significant technology investments to really be prepared for FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, that was enacted a few years ago. Additionally, real-time feedback in the supply chain is a major reinvestment opportunity that is being deployed to increase supply chain visibility and to deepen the understanding of omni-channel capabilities.
Gosh, thanks, Brendan. That's such a good overview and kind of helps articulate a lot of uncertainty. And so with all of this uncertainty, what have consumers embraced as they head to the grocery store and other retail outlets for their food?
Definitely, Jen. So I had the luxury of spending a little bit of time with one of our grocery experts here at CLA, Brian Baumgard. He was able to really give me a deep dive at what our grocery clients, as well as some of our retail food clients, are experiencing over the last few months. So in April, the price of groceries rose approximately 2.6%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, resulting in the largest one-month increase of grocery prices since 1974. Even more alarming, the increase in egg prices shot up over 16% on average across the nation. But even more eye-popping, in some areas of the country, the increases were even larger. For example, the price of ground beef in the DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth area, increased approximately 15%. The price of chicken breast in the LA area skyrocketed more than 26%, and the price of orange juice in the same area, almost 15% increases, according to Nielsen data. From a restaurant perspective, it can really be hit or miss, depending on the level of COVID restrictions in place, which again can really depend on based on your region, state, and in some cases, even the city you live in. We have seen significant price fluctuations from restaurants that can be a mere mile apart from one another.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy. And there are so many moving pieces that go into this from the food and beverage supply chain side of things. I wonder, as a consumer, and certainly for myself, what can I expect going into the grocery store on the 4th of July holiday weekend?
That is a fantastic question, Jen, and I'm glad you asked it. So as Eric laid out for us before, we don't expect to see those meat shortages. So the meat will be there. So that's some good news. However, we are seeing many food brands scaling back on the amount of SKUs that they have at a particular retailer in an effort to really optimize some of these food supply chain issues that we've seen over the last couple of months. So you may have to settle for those plain Oreos instead of a coconut cream pie or maple bacon, at least for the time being. Sorry, Eric. On your way out of town for the 4th of July, you can also expect reduced SKU counts at your favorite fast food restaurants as well. One in particular, McDonald's, recently announced that they will only consider bringing back approximately 7 menu items of the dozens of menu items that were dropped off the menu at the start of the pandemic. Additionally, You may feel a slight increase across all food products that we're buying at the grocery store or at the retailer. But we do expect that these prices are going to continue to normalize over the next 10 to 14 days, which should give you comfort that the prices you're seeing today will likely be pretty close to what you'll see as you go and make your ultimate purchases for your 4th of July festivities. So Eric, to further that point, what are you seeing from the pricing of livestock and meat markets as it stands today?
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. The latest USDA retail reports suggest currently meat prices are in a bullwhip, which is really inflated prices due to the low supply that we've had in the past. Now, retail prices usually have a 2-week lag in response, so to the current posture of the supply chain. So it is expected that grocery retail prices will deflate over the next couple of weeks, right in time for your barbecue cookout.
Awesome.
That's really helpful. Both of you guys, thank you so much for this solid update on the impact to the food and beverage industry as a result of everything that we're dealing with COVID and the economic relief packages. So thank you very much. As I said at the beginning of the session, we have Jack back for an update on PPP forgiveness and the discussion of the new IFR that was issued last night. There's always some kind of breaking news when it comes to having Jack on the show. So Jack, welcome back.
Nice to see you again.
It's great to have you here. I'd like to start our conversation today by having you provide us an update with one of the key things that came out in that IFR, which was the timing of the application for forgiveness.
Yeah, so as we had expected, Secretary Mnuchin had kind of signaled this. We did get some relief in terms of the 24-week period. And so it does appear that you will be able to file for loan forgiveness sometime before the end of the 24-week period if you decide to use something other than the 8-week period, if you had gotten a loan before June 5th. However, though, we didn't really get a lot of guidance about how mechanically that's going to work, right? So we've got a couple different applications out there yet, neither one of which has been amended, for this recent guidance. And, really the only additional guidance we got was the way that the wage reduction test would get applied in the event of that you're going to use this period somewhere longer than 8 weeks, but less than 24 weeks. And the guidance that we got there, unfortunately, wasn't particularly borrower friendly. And so it actually says that if you did have a wage reduction, you would have to consider the impact of that wage reduction for the entire 24-week period. So, you're going to get penalized for that, even though you might have, only been using a 12-week period, for instance, to file your loan forgiveness application. You'll have a reduction based on the full 24-week period. So what that really tells me is that you really need to eliminate those wage reductions before you do the filing of your application. And so as long as you've eliminated the wage reduction by the time you file for forgiveness, then you fall under that safe harbor, and so you don't need to apply the wage reduction test. So that will be very important. Also, the guidance didn't even talk about the FTE reduction test. And to me, that's starting to signal a little bit about what the SBA's expectations are, and the fact that many borrowers likely won't be impacted by the FTE reduction test because of the safe harbors that were provided.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think that's super helpful. I know also included is a good example about the alternative payroll cover period. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of questions about, how much am I going to get to include, whether it's the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period. Is it only 8 weeks? Is it more than 8 weeks? And the example that is given in the new IFR is pretty clear that you get to deduct everything that is paid during the covered period or the alternative payroll covered period, as well as on the back end what was incurred but then got paid right after the covered period as well. And so it seems still that, if you're on a weekly payroll, you'll likely be able to include 9 weeks. If you're on a biweekly payroll, you'll likely be able to include, let's say, 10 weeks of payroll potentially. And same thing with monthly and bi-monthly or semi-monthly, you might get to include more than 8 weeks of payroll, depending on when that first pay period or payroll check disbursement occurred in relation to the funding of your loan amount. So, we did get some clarity on that. Still have questions as to how that would get applied, and we hope the FAQs clarify that the intention is to include more than potentially 8 weeks, during an 8-week period. Now, if you're going to use the 24-week period, obviously you don't have to get as nuanced because you'll have a broader period of time to make sure you use all the funds you need. But the example they provided in the IFR was very helpful.
Yeah, it sounds helpful, especially for those who are trying to use that original 8-week period. So
Yep.
I appreciate you walking through that. I know our inbox is going crazy with questions related to it. So we'll get to those in just a second. But I want to also talk about the owner-employee definition and what clarity came from that in the IFR.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of the examples that had been given in the application and in the EZ application had specifically talked about owner employees in the context of an S corporation. And so there really wasn't anything that mentioned C corporation owner employees. And so there was speculation that maybe C corporation owner employees were not included in that owner employee category. This IFR did dispel that rumor, though, and it clearly states that owner employees for C corporations do still get listed in that owner bucket, but it did give some guidance on how owner employees should be handled, right? So similarly, for the 8-week period, similar to other ones, you use 2019 wages, and assuming owner employees made $100,000 or more, they would be subject to the 15,385 cap on compensation. And if you're going to use a longer period, up to that 24-week period, they are limited to 2.5 months of the 2019 compensation. Now, the language is a little murky, and I guess it's up to interpretation on whether or not those limitations apply to just the wage component or also retirement and healthcare contributions for C Corp employees. We believe, though, that for C Corp employees, in addition to the wages, you'll also get to include relevant retirement plan contributions and healthcare contributions. So that was very helpful, and so we have that clarity now related to C Corps. The IFR also kind of reiterates the rules that were out there related to S Corp and Schedule C filers and general partners as well. And for the S Corp one, in particular, it did clarify again that, for S Corporation owner employees, you use 2019 wages. You can include retirement plan contributions, again, limited based on 2019 actual and subject to that 2.5-month cap. And you cannot include healthcare for S Corp employees.
That's really helpful. Is there anything else worth discussing about the limitations on owner compensation for purposes of forgiveness?
The one thing that we knew already, but doesn't get a lot of press, and that got reiterated in this IFR, had to do with owner employees that might be included on multiple applications, right? Because you might be a partner in multiple partnerships, for instance, that filed for the PPP loan. Mm-hmm. And so it did, this IFR did specifically call out that the limitations, either the 15,385 or the 20,833, the 2.5-month limitation, applies across all companies that an owner employee is part of. And so you're not able to get, let's say, 15,385 per entity for an individual. You're only able to get 15,385 for that one individual across all the entities that they may be included on. So that's just something we already knew, but doesn't get a lot of press, and it did get highlighted again in this IFR.
Yeah, and definitely worth noting for purposes of our conversation today. We also have this new safe harbor, right, about a borrower's level of business activity, and that does seem to be very important to the forgiveness calculations. Yeah. Can you share anything with us on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, what we're really feeling is that this new safe harbor is going to almost eliminate the FTE reduction test for a lot of borrowers. Because there's a lot of concern out there that you did have decreases in headcount. The guidance originally stated that you had to see a decrease in business activity and therefore a decrease in headcount as a result of one of three federal agencies and the rules and guidance published by those agencies. The IFR actually expanded that a little bit, knowing that most of those agencies didn't have a direct result on what happened at a restaurant in your local community. That really the thing that was driving that was either a state, a city, or a county order that was based on the guidance that was out there from the CDC or OSHA, for instance. And so as a result of that, the IFR expanded this guidance now and said that if it's either directly or indirectly stemming from the regulation or the guidance provided by one of those three federal agencies, and you saw a decrease in your business activity during your covered period, you are exempted from the FTE reduction test. So we really do think that test for businesses that saw any kind of decline will basically eliminate the need to do the FTE reduction test. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, we think that that's why it really wasn't addressed when we talked about the shorter filing period, because I think Treasury is really, the expectation is that test is largely going to go away now. Now, I do want to note, though, that this could be a little bit of a catch-22, because you do have to provide documentation to support the fact that you were impacted by these orders. And so you're going to have to point to either the city, state, or county order that was based on one of the federal orders or guidance that caused you to have this reduction. But they also are asking that you have to provide relevant financial information. And so this will be the first time that you have to give potentially information about revenue sources as evidence that you saw a decline during the period of time if you want to rely on this safe harbor. And so it's unclear on what they're going to do with that, other than to verify that, yeah, it looks like, they had a decrease in revenue, therefore their activity was lower than it was before. But we don't know. And it's always scary to give new information to a governmental entity that they didn't have before. But we do think that this is a great new safe harbor, is likely going to eliminate the need for the FTE test in a lot of cases that would have caused some of the forgiveness not to be obtained by borrowers.
Yeah, thanks so much. I don't think anybody's going to cry about the elimination of that test.
Exactly.
Let's hit some of these questions that are coming in the last couple of minutes we have left. So the first is from Rebecca, and she's asking the following related to unemployment expense. She says, we received a bill from the state for a former employee that is receiving unemployment. Under the PPP guidelines, this should be an allowable expense, correct? She just wants to confirm. And then she goes on to say the expense was incurred and paid during their 8 weeks. However, unemployment invoices always list how much they paid the recipient per week. A few of these weeks started before our PPP loan date of May 11th of 2020. And she's asking, should I prorate the bill or include it 100% because that is when we incurred the expense and paid it? So kind of a mouthful there, but if you could address the unemployment expense, I think that would answer some of the other questions coming in too.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a bit unclear. I mean, intuitively, you would think that the unemployment bill that you're getting from the state is something that would be includable. But right now, what you're being asked to include on the PPP forgiveness application is basically things that show up on your payroll records. And unfortunately, these unemployment invoices from the state are not going to run through your payroll record. So I think part of your question is, well, where would I put it on the application? The answer is there really isn't a place to include it. And so then that gets back to, well, is it includable? And, at this point, absent clear guidance that it is includable, we would probably recommend not including it, particularly because now you've got the flexibility of a longer period of time, and you will be able to hopefully meet the or use full loan proceeds without having to deal with nuanced things like this. Now, we are expecting, more FAQs to come out, and hopefully we will get some guidance that addresses things like unemployment. But right now, we're leaning towards that. Those are not includable in the forgiveness calculation, actually.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Knowing our luck, those FAQs will come out about 30 minutes before the show on Thursday. So,
of course.
Again, always a good reason to tune into that COVID landing page, though, for that information. Another question came in that I think is really important to address. It says, "Hi, my bank tells me they won't be accepting forgiveness applications until the SBA finalizes the rules for these applications. Have you been seeing any banks processing the applications yet? And if not, when do you anticipate that process beginning?"
Yeah, right now the SBA has been providing very little guidance to the banks. And so, we have an FI practice, Todd Springs, part of that group who usually is on with us here. And the banks really don't know how to process applications at this point. There's been some guidance that's talked to the banks about what the expectations are in terms of that they have to review, matching up documents provided by the borrowers. But that was before the new rules came out. There was some guidance in the new IFR last night that did talk a little bit more about what the banks need to do. But currently, there's not even a mechanism for the banks to communicate to the SBA once they've completed their review. And so that process hasn't been put in place yet. And I mentioned last week that the SBA is doing a lot of presentations now. We sat into one presentation last week, and the SBA representative actually said that because the guidance out there to banks really isn't clear yet, that it is likely that they will give the banks a little relief on that 60-day period of time that they have to review applications, because since they could start receiving applications for forgiveness now, but don't really know what they're supposed to do with them yet, they might need more time, which would seem to indicate that the rules and the guidance to banks might still be a couple weeks out from the SBA at this point. So I wouldn't anticipate that if you submitted your application for forgiveness now, that it's going to get a lot of attention from the banks until they have clear guidance on that. So what you're hearing from your bank is consistent with what we're seeing from all the banks that we work with at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to have one more question. I know we're closing in here on time, but somebody said, "I have another question for our PPP loan. Our 8-week period ends this Friday, June 26th. Would it be all right for us to give every employee an extra $500 for hazard pay? And is there any definition that they need to follow?" And she goes on to say that would help us use up almost all of our loans. So just thought we'd cover that before we call it a wrap.
Sure. Yeah, so there was an IFR that came out that did talk about hazard pay and bonuses, and clearly said that you can pay bonuses or include hazard pay, obviously subject to the limitations that are out there. So if you're using the 8-week period, that 15,385 limitation that you have. The one thing we're encouraging people to do, though, is make sound business decisions, right? So if paying bonuses is part of your normal process, or you had committed to paying hazard pay because you're putting your employees in a situation that deserves that, then by all means go ahead and pay those bonuses. But now that we've got potentially the ability to use more than an 8-week period, and the ability to have some flexibility about when you file for forgiveness, I wouldn't make a bad business decision and do something you wouldn't ordinarily do just to maximize forgiveness during that 8-week period. Take another week, pay another regular payroll if your policy is not to generally use bonuses, and then just ask for forgiveness using a 9-week period instead. To me, that seems to be more prudent from a business owner's perspective, rather than to do a little bit more and do something you wouldn't normally do that you don't feel you'd get a benefit for. But on the flip side, if I had somebody ask me last week about, well, we normally pay bonuses on June 30th. We know what they're going to be already. Can I pay them now to include them? Clearly, that was a normal business practice, and so they just accelerated the payment of that by a week or two to include it in the covered period and then filed for their 8 weeks. To me, that kind of business decision makes sense. So, use sound business judgment. Don't do things just to maximize forgiveness during that 8-week period. Now that we've got some flexibility, I think that'll serve you well.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, what I really hear you saying is don't let the tail wag the dog in this situation. Really do the right thing for the business as opposed to just the loan. So, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. It went super fast today. So, thank you so much to all of you as our guests. Jack, it was great talking to you again with the fresh updates. Brendan and Eric, that information was some of the best we've had as far as how is this really directly impacting our lives? So thank you for giving us some more stuff to think about and just some tips and tricks for getting through the 4th of July weekend. We all really appreciate that. For those of you in the audience, we'd like for you to remind you to continue to visit our COVID landing page for more up-to-date information, news, highlights, tools, and further consultation. You can always contact us using the Contact Us button on that page, as well as reaching out to us again at livestream@claconnect.com with ideas for future show topics. We will do our best to get back to you as quickly as we can. Please also subscribe to our email. There's a link provided in the box below me so that we can continue to share this up-to-date information and demos of some of these tools that we know you're using to really get through this process. That's all we have. Please continue to send us questions, and we will be back on Thursday with more information. So thank you for watching, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Thanks.